Hello. This is, Kalzune speaking. I've decided to do this differently by just doing a voiceover or just a standalone audio file. Because I'm too distracted when I do other things. I can't really multitask, you know? That would have been abundantly clear if you've seen anything I've done before, where what I'm trying to do gets completely, left out, blotched out, whenever I start doing things in the other thing. So I'd be, playing a video game while trying to talk about something, but whenever I'm talking about something, it just gets completely ignored and I lose my train of thought while I'm playing said video game. And I do not think that's really a good thing at all. Because once the stream of consciousness gets broken too much, the original purpose of everything is lost. If I remember correctly from last episode, I was talking about why I am not an anarchist. Yes, that was what I was talking about. And as such, I have to probably give what alternative system, what minarchy I am going to suggest that will enshrine the rights of people without sliding into tyranny. It's not an easy question to answer. I don't think it's impossible, though. Just not very easy. And as such, we just have to consider the beginning, I guess. What rights do people have? What system are we aiming for? And what checks and balances do we need in place in order to make sure we actually achieve these goals? Because some goals just cannot be accomplished with some methods, and therefore the methods are bad for the goals. And sometimes things are contradictory, so you can't even accomplish them, even if you were to aim for it using those goals. That's why socialism never works. Moving along. So, I guess in order to actually figure that out, I need to create basically a hierarchy of ideals, I think. This is kind of like realpolitik. Maybe a little bit of realpolitik. Not too much, though. Too much realpolitik is where you don't actually care about any morals or ideals. That's probably not a good thing to do. You should have ideals and morals you follow and some principles to your actions. It's just which ones are actually principles and which ones are just nice to have that are derived by the principles but could be sacrificed in order to actually achieve the higher order ideals. And as such, we should figure out what these higher order ideals are. So the best place to start, I think, would be just what rights do we have? All rights are negative rights. Positive rights come from our actions using negative rights and whatever nature has to make something more. You know, it would be nice if we had the right to food, but we weren't born with an infinite supply of food or the ability to snap our fingers and make food appear, so it's not really a right we have, it's more of a privilege we've obtained. It's kind of sad, it's kind of brutal, but it's the truth. The natural state of humanity is poverty and destitution. It is only through our actions that we can escape it. Make sense? Hopefully. I know it's a really sad view to have, but it's true. People before capitalism, or even before artisanal creation, before tools, the first people were just completely destitute and impoverished. They had to find food, they had to, do all these things, or else they would die, because none of them are actually rights. The only thing they had a right to do was to try to manifest their destiny and capabilities into survival. And as such, the best place to look will probably be with John Locke, obviously. I think The ability to take a person, shove them into the state of nature where there's nothing but themselves, should show them what kind of innate rights they have. Without any outside interference, of course. And then what we see is that, well, this person has a right to just live. They're already living, and nothing influences that. They can continue living. They're allowed to live. I think that's pretty obvious. They have life. They have the ability to basically do whatever they want. Like, if there's no one else in the equation and it's just them, and if nothing stops them, like the laws of physics, they just do what they want. Maybe there's like some action that they feel compelled to do because they will die without it, but they're still allowed to do it. And they're allowed to also not do it for whatever reasons they have. So they basically have liberty. The liberty to do what they want. And the third one is, these people, if that's all there is, they can claim objects. I don't know what point they would have to claiming an object. Maybe it makes their life more convenient or something, but that's not really the point. The point is that they could find something that's not claimed, something in nature, and just claim it as their own property. And there you go. You have these like 3 rights that like every person has. Their like life, their liberty, their property. It is very simple. Anything beyond that is probably not an actual right in the sense of like people can always do this and have this no matter what. However, there is a restriction to this because we're considering one person. If there was a second person or more people than 2, you have to consider how they like interact with one another. Can one person infringe on the rights of another person? And if so, when? If at all. Taking this idea of rights in nature, and if we want to be like as consistent as possible with them, they should be inalienable. So that means people can live inalienable without other people coming along and taking away that right to living. Same goes for liberty and property through the same logical process. And as such, a person's rights end when they're going to violate someone else's rights. This comes from like J.S. Mill, I'm pretty sure, and many other writers follow that tradition. It's just setting up the stage of like basic libertarianism. And as such, when these like rights get violated, because in technicality they can be violated, and when they do, if the strong is stronger than the weak and no one else goes after them, the person actually just loses their rights. This is why anarchy doesn't work. But the idea is, if it was a completely equal like playing field, is that this person who just got their rights violated would be in the right to, get retribution for the harm that has been done with them, if they can. They don't have to, but like they're allowed to, and they would be seen as morally and ethically correct in doing such. With these ideas, we're already starting to see what kind of like goals and constraints our system needs to follow in order to achieve these like super high order ideals, which is like an inalienable right to life, liberty, property, and to stop others from infringing on those rights, or if they do infringe on those rights, some kind of retribution for the harm they have caused. I think that sets the stage pretty simply for like the rights themselves. But then we have to ask, how does like property work? And is there like different kinds of property? How should property be dealt with? Well, going by this idea that like people are free to like own and supposedly disown property as well, it would be strange if you had to eternally own an object. This leads us to like, oh yeah, and they also have the liberty to like do what they want with said objects. So that leads pretty naturally to this idea of like free exchange. So, if person A owns like an apple and person B owns like a dagger they made, they're allowed to trade these things. And of course, person A and person B, they don't want to give up their object like that. If they're going to do an exchange, they either think the exchange is going to be of equal or greater value to them once they make it, which then, builds the system of free exchange, the system of capitalism. Currency evolves from the ability of bartering being just like inefficient. It's easier to sell your item for money and then use that money to buy the item you want. So money becomes important. Being able to freely trade that money, super important. The ability to freely trade, very important. Because there's also like some other issues too with like of just like completely unadulterated trade, is that like if you're doing a trade and you're promised something and it's not actually the thing you want, you've technically been violated because you didn't actually make the trade for the thing you want, but for something you've been swindled on. You've just basically been defrauded of value. So that's something we have to deal with as well, is this idea of fraud. And maybe, just maybe, there could be this one issue of like, you have this community and it has like a group of A people, like group A, and then like a smaller group of people, group B. And the way this system is set up is that even though they're exchanging for the same things, group A decides for whatever reason to never do trade with group B, for I don't know which reasons that would be. But this could basically turn them destitute, depending on if the right criteria are met to remove any ability for Group B to make their own living. It's a little difficult to do that, but not impossible, because there are different types of property as well, which would be best explained by the Lockean proviso. Okay. So, the Lockean proviso is basically this idea where you're allowed to claim things from nature, but you're supposed to leave enough for others to use. So, like, there's a finite amount of land. You're allowed to claim land and use it, but if you don't leave enough land for other people to use, you're basically completely starving them out of any type of meaningful use of their labor, of ownership. It is very hard to like own something when there's nothing you can claim. The biggest part where this comes in is honestly land, because think about it. If somehow we've got a few people who claim all the land, they're kings. They control everything. They're the king, they're the queen, they're the monarch. They own all the land and they rightfully owned it. If we use the, what's the word Nozick used? It had to do with proposition, entitlement theory. Like the entitlement theory, like this, let's say these people have claimed all the land in the world rightfully. So, through the entitlement theory, they own every single plot of land. That means any person that's born or exists that doesn't own land is forced to either work for this person for land, or I don't know why you'd give up the land if you own it all, because it allows you to basically do serfdom. That's why the monarchs and lords and barons had so much fucking money, is because of serfdom. But it's like, you own all this land, and now these people who do not have land and cannot get land because you've claimed all the land are forced to work under you and your land as the monarch or king or whatever you want to call yourself. They have no choice in the matter. There's no land to claim. They are subjects to you. And it's very simple. They either work for you or you die. It's kind of brutal. They've basically been completely stripped away of the ability to own property or anything, really, because someone else claimed all the land first, and they're forced to just accept this fact that they just will never have land, and they have to work for whatever the landowner says they have to work for, unless if there's some new technology that allows us to produce things without land, or, well, just make things without land, I guess, or get more land, or go to space. Things that help us avoid this natural limit we currently have, which is land is finite, but the wants and needs of people are not finite, and they're going to continue growing. Scarcity. As such, we need some way to combat, like, this, the commons, like, there are some materials that are in the commons, and if people already use them, or if the value of those materials come from the people around them and not from the material itself, land does that all the time, it has to somehow be given back to the commons if you're going to use or harm the commons. So, that also includes pollution or food waste, probably. And now, we're starting to see that there are some key mechanisms of a state that need to exist, and where you can cut it off, because the things that aren't mentioned are completely fair game. As such, we need to build up a state that holds all of these things to be inerrant and upholds these rights. First and foremost would probably be a system of law. I would say the best place to start would be a combination of natural and common law, with the only time you could ever give your executives powers is if there's like a special wartime clause, because you have to consider other nations that want to violate your rights, and like the best way to deal with it is probably through some level of nationalization during times of war, but has to go back afterwards, or else you're going to end up basically in as bad as a situation as if you've lost the war. And along with that is natural and common law, and also some very limited executive power. You really have to put checks and balances on those. And as such, you probably want a very strict constitution that barely changes, if at all, as you want to keep your core beliefs completely rigid and stagnant, and to not have people interpret it wrongly, so you probably have to update the wording as well. We don't want another example of the Second Amendment where it's clearly meant for the civilians, the people to own firearms, but the people who don't like freedom, who don't like civilians, who don't like anyone but the state being able to control what people can or can't do, try to misconstrue it in this most damnedest way to take away someone's rights. So that means we need to have some kind of court system, some kind of way to execute it, and the way to fund it. Well, the way of funding it is actually pretty simple. You see, when someone violates the rights of someone else, we've already said they kind of lost some rights, otherwise you can't do retribution to them. From that violation of rights, that's where you can actually do just taxation. It's different from taxing profits made completely fairly. You can't tax that. That's really immoral. But to tax someone, or take some of that money from the harm, the retribution, and use it to keep the state running because they're the ones completing the retribution, that's completely moral. That's completely fine, and that's actually a good system. Only if people actually do taxation like that. Moving along has to do with, the bare minimum standardizations and fraud preventions to have a free market economy. Because as nice as it would be to think that, anarchy could accomplish all of that, there's no reason to assume that the same swindles we see from the state wouldn't be worse or the same from private individuals. Because, let's just take, for example, printing money. The government loves doing that. It's great for stealing the income of the poor as they give it to the rich. It's awful. Money printing is really bad. But to allow the private enterprise to do that would also be really, really bad, because they could do the same mechanisms. Because the thing with inflation is that it is a lagging mechanism. So, if there was some kind of currency, it doesn't really matter what it is. It could be silver coins even. People trade using silver. This one person could buy lower value silver bars, stamp them into coins and then hoard a bunch of them. And then what they can do is basically dump all the coins into the market to like get as much value as possible. You know, the currency collapses, but it doesn't matter. They already got their free money out of it, basically. It's a lot like a crypto pump and dump, which is why crypto will probably never work as a currency minus the gambling. So in a sense, you need some level of like currency control. Also standardization of currency. People must like trade in the same currency or else, or like something of actual value. Because if you don't, you end up with like coal towns where you only pay people in company scripts and then you've basically enslaved them. Go you. So you would likely need some kind of like standardized legal tender, preferably backed by some material, you know, that has a fixed amount. You know, if you keep the like amount of tender in the system fixed, even without a backing, but I don't trust people enough to give them a backless money. So, you know, a money backed by some material of a finite amount in circulation is a great fixed value, and everyone just uses it. Like that's a pretty good monetary system. It allows free trade. It stops people from being unable to trade because they don't have currency X or Y or Z, or stopping people from influencing the currency market like illegally or in ways that would undermine capitalism as a whole. You know, fraud prevention, you know, the most basic standardizations, you know, like food labels, same measurements, same information, etc., etc., etc. Allow people to actually make rational decisions and for them to actually be true to their words without being fucking scammed. Another one would also be like making sure the contracts are like upheld, you know, making sure that like any type of contracts for labor, all the risks are set out, you know, avoiding overly dangerous working conditions because, you know, unless you agree to said working conditions, if these conditions like jeopardize you and end you up getting like harmed or hurt, they've technically done some level of like rights violation as you're not like told of these said risks. So, you know, they would get sued and then they pay money and then, you know, more tax money to the state as well through the retribution. And, you know, also like the most basic level of standardization needed to make the like economy work smoothly. I think a good example of that would be like the fact that all homes in the US use the exact same power, you know, 60 hertz, 120 volt AC. Like that's a pretty good system because it has a twofold effect. First of all, it allows for like greater adaptability of goods and services, and it streamlines production. You know, that makes it easy to do startups because, you know, you have to design it for this and not for like 7 different home layouts. It also allows like businesses to trade out power services easier because, you know, if you're expected to give out the exact same type of power, company A and B can easily be like linked to a home and there will be no issues of needing like new things. It's just like, it's a really good quality of life thing, and it makes things so much easier for both the consumer and the producer to know that there's like some minimum standard that needs to be met for goods. Of course, this is not going overboard. You know, it's not like, you're no longer allowed to have anything unique. It's just for like general things. Like, if your product relies on an external good or product to work, there should be some level of standardization between the linking mechanisms between these two products. You know, like, if you're like, let's say you want your bracket to be able to connect to another bracket or girder or something, you'd probably want to make sure they use the same bolt size, like ALSI or metric or whatever it is. You want to make sure that like these standards actually exist so that things can work smoothly and efficiently and there's no headaches that didn't need to be caused in the first place. And that moves into the most contentious part, which is kind of protected under the Lockean Proviso and what I was getting into, a possible land value tax. Because the idea is, you know, the Proviso, leave enough as needed for others. Land is completely unique in terms of other types of materials. First of all, it's like super inherently scarce and it's unmovable too. But another thing is that the value of land doesn't actually really come from the land except for resources. It comes from the things around it. Like land in New York City is worth infinitely more than a random patch of land in Wyoming. It's just the truth. Like external factors is what makes the land more valuable. And since it is these external factors that give land its like premium value, it kind of makes sense that like these people deserve some kind of payment for making the land more valuable. Which is a very esoteric argument, but it technically works. And as such, with this like land value tax, it also stops people from just hoarding and speculating land, because the more land you own, and if you do nothing with this land, you're going to end up bleeding your pockets dry, first of all. But second of all, you're not actually using the land, you're being wasteful with a scarce resource, and you're harming society by just owning land and doing nothing with it. Because the part of having the land is that you're using it for something. Like, you're claiming it to actually use it. Like when you get money, and even if you like to hoard money, you're saving the money to eventually use it later or for your children or something. I guess the same can be said for land as well, but land is something that can't be made more of. Like you can hoard fruit, but more fruit can be made. If you hoard land, no more land can be made currently, so it's not something you can just truly hoard like that. And also, the value is dictated by others around you. So you're just holding on to this land, doing nothing, and you're making just free money out of thin air. Like, land is one of those things that the private market, I don't think, can actually handle, and can actually undermine the private market in the long term. Because, as soon as you get like a big realtor company owning 20, 30, 50% of the land, you're really going to start squeezing people dry, and that's not good. Does this mean the garbage should have the right to do eminent domain and take away land? Definitely not. But if you're going to own excessive land, there should be like a price you pay to not even use the land. If you just own this empty patch that's completely useless, that could be used for something, like a new apartment complex or a factory or a store. You're paying the same tax either way, so you might as well actually put the land to use. And I guess there should also be a distinction between land that's for the buildings put on top of it and land used for like resource extraction. Because with resource extraction, the value of the land is based on the resources in it, so it's going to be taxed differently. And it also gives like the people doing resource extraction an incentive to work as fast as possible to remove said resources, because the longer you leave it there idle, the higher the land value tax will be. But if you remove it quickly, the land loses value because you're removing resources, and then this leaves you with like less land taxes and also more resources into society for cheaper. I think it's a pretty good system. And not only that, like after resource extraction, the land is usually considered almost completely worthless. So that means any like conspiring or like, some kind of like thoughtful like capitalist could come in and see this like super cheap land that's been used for a purpose, buy it and then repurpose it for something else, and with like reduced taxes because no one wants the land. It would help us to be a lot more efficient with our land use if there are penalties for not actually using said land or just leaving it to be. Of course, the only issue with like a land value tax is that technically, in terms of like housing, the land value tax of the housing can be passed down to the individuals living in said housing. But at that point, it's kind of fair because they're actually using the land for something. This is just to stop people from like hoarding land excessively. And then I would say, for like pollution, have your like carbon credits or whatever, and try to somehow tax food waste by the ton or pound or whatever, so that way there's an incentive to, instead of just throwing away food, you're actually giving it to people to eat. Because, because you're taking away this like resource that like could have been used by society, should have been used by society, and you're just wasting it. Waste should have some level of penalty because, making waste excessively is just not a good thing to do. It's hard to explain like the philosophical reasoning behind it. It's not an easy thing to explain. It really isn't. I wish it was. And also, if we have this like society, we're going to assume like a social contract because, if you're in the state, you kind of agree to these like rules and conditions. You must also be allowed to freely leave them as well. That's a super important part to add if you want to actually make a social contract in the modern day. It's like, if you're in this society and you decide to like actually make your like businesses or storefronts or whatever public, like you're offering a service to what we would consider society, like you're like, if you're going to do like marketing to society for some kind of good or service in public space, you probably have to follow some level of, you probably lose some level of freedom of association to allow anyone to buy your goods. Like, if you decide to put up some billboard in your town saying, I am selling these items for this amount of money, and there's like no terms of exclusion, I don't even think you could have anyone excluded if you're like outwardly advertising to anyone to see it, to buy it, because that would just kind of make no sense, first of all, but also be a bit discriminatory. Once you make like your ventures or business or whatever public to like the public, you kind of cannot be allowed to discriminate anymore. Like if it's some private venture, like you're only offering it to some people, that's completely fine. You're allowed to have complete freedom of association and private deals. But once you start making like a public venture, I think that's when things like the Civil Rights Act start really like kicking in. Because it's like, if you don't do this, you start ending up with some level of like disenfranchisement of those people that you're not allowing to buy from you, and I don't think that's a very good thing. And as such, it's just like it might be just a necessity. That also includes for land. Like if you have land, or like if you're going to be a realtor in the land, you're automatically in the public, so you can't discriminate based on race or sex or whatever on land. Also, that's an important thing. There has to be some level of universality to like the laws people like follow. Like if you're going to have a law, it can't really discriminate against different individuals. Because if you do that, it's no longer like a free or equal society, and you're overstepping natural rights to make one group be treated better or less than the other group, and that's just a form of just group-based corruption. It's not good. And as such, that's an important thing to have. What else to touch on? I guess I could also touch on this, So yeah, some level of like equality of people within a society. That doesn't mean they automatically gain like entitlements to anything. Not any entitlements that they don't already have from negative rights, like, if you are group A or group B, group A doesn't naturally own anything from group V and vice versa, but they both have a stake in the commons. What else? So I covered that. What else is there? It's kind of difficult to think of. For the most part, I think I've said almost everything I've needed to say, but I'm trying to think if I missed something. I think I covered it for the most part. I mean, yeah, like your natural freedoms are to be protected, you know, like freedom of speech, etc., etc., etc. The few legitimate forms of taxation, there's about 4 of them at most. Well, it falls into one category, but you know what I mean. The basics of law, yeah. The commons, and why discrimination in the commons would not be acceptable in a society. Though you are allowed to keep people out of your society based on the social contract. You know, because if they don't agree to it, they don't really have a right to the commons. You know, there could be like certain requirements in order to actually have access to the commons. So that could exist. Because the idea of why we're doing this, instead of just going for complete anarchy, is that what we're doing is we're taking like our highest ideals, you know, like having a free market system and having negative rights be guarded, equality of said negative rights, at the cost of like the absoluteness of those virtues. That's the form of realpolitik I was getting into while talking about this. And in the end, you kind of end up with some kind of minarchy system, some kind of realpolitik minarchy. You know, the system, the ideology I want to work on, the ideology I want to make and fully write out. I don't think I've read enough to truly write what I want to write, but I have a general plan and idea of what it'd be, and I think for the most part I've described it like verbatim. And as such, I think that's a good place to end this audio recording. So I shall leave it here. And maybe if like this works out well, I can make more of these. Maybe I can answer some questions, maybe read some interesting things and see where it goes. So I'll see you later.